Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the July Web A&R series. My name is Lynn Schmidt-McQuitty, and I am the Healthy Families and Community Strategic Initiative Leader. And our panel has invited Faye Moncloa and Dorina Espinosa, both Youth Development advisors, Faye from Santa Clara County and Dorina from Del Norte and Humboldt County, to be our participants or our presenters this morning. So thank you all for tuning in. We have a 20-minute session for them to present their information and then a 10-minute Q&A session. I will be monitoring the chat box, so feel free to either hold your questions until the end or to send questions in via chat as the presentation is going forward. So thank you again, Faye and Dorina, for joining us, and I'll let you take things away.
Thank you, Lynn. So as Lynn said, I am the 4-H advisor in Santa Clara County, and Dorina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm the Youth, Families, and Communities Advisor in Humboldt and Del Norte counties.
Great. And both Dorina and I have been part of this project for at least 5 years. I started this project with, hold on a second. I started this project back in 2013 with Shannon Jarillo, who's now the Associate Director of Corporate Extension in University of Nevada. And Shannon will continue to collaborate with us on data analysis and journal publications. But I also want to acknowledge the rest of our team who are change agents and diversity champions. Thanks to this team, we have been successful in the efforts that we will share with you today. So in this short presentation, we'll start by grounding our conversation on intercultural competence. We'll share with you the research questions that drives this project, some of the educational interventions we have used, results, outcomes, and possible recommendations for the larger implementation within A&R. So we started this project, as I mentioned, in 2013. To put things into context, between 1983 and 2013, the Latino population grew by 300% in the US. In California, and according to the 2010 census, about 50% of youth were of Hispanic or Latino origin or descent. And then this chart describes the racial makeup. In 2013, when we started this project, about 25% of the 4-H youth population were Latinos. So faced with this context, we decided to increase the intercultural competence of our colleagues in the 4-H program. So we know that to be effective in another culture, people need to be interested in other culture and be sensitive enough to notice these cultural differences. And intercultural competence, as defined by Mitch Hammer, is a professional development effort that is successful only when it's based on individuals' developmental orientation. And in a few moments, we will describe what those are. And these orientations are assessed by the Intercultural Development Inventory. So what is intercultural competence? Milton Bennett defines intercultural competence as a set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral skills and characteristics that support effective and appropriate interaction in a variety of cultural contexts. Milton Bennett came up with this definition after studying for many decades people in the Peace Corps that went from the US to different countries and then came back. Then Mitch Hammer then builds on this work and describes intercultural competence as the capacity to shift cultural perspective and adapt appropriately to cultural similarities and differences, and then navigate and bridge these cultural differences. Our work, the project that we're presenting to you today, uses an integrated conceptual framework. When we started this work, all of the diversity awareness workshops were a one-shot deal, or like maybe an hour or 2 hours, or sometimes even a whole day. It ignored where people were at. So at most, these workshops raised awareness about diversity, and that was it, but there was no behavioral change. To bring about an organizational change effort, we used Klaver's 8 steps for organizational change. We used the work from Milton Bennett on intercultural sensitivity. And then we also framed learning as social cultural that happens between experts and novices, and also in groups and in conversation. We briefly share here what the 8-step change model is in case you're not familiar with it. We use this framework because in the past I had been successful in implementing change in my county using this framework. And then we brought this in because we were changing how 4-H does professional development around intercultural competence. And now Dorina will guide you through the intercultural development continuum.
Great, thank you, Faye. So Faye just mentioned a couple of times in different wording this idea of individual developmental orientation. So this model that we use, the intercultural development model, exists to help us understand our own individual capacity in interpreting and understanding intercultural development. So this continuum goes from denial all the way up to adaptation. In the denial, there's a state of awareness or lack of awareness of cultural similarities and differences. And polarization, when we see differences in cultures, it's judged oftentimes by our own culture. And someone in minimization tends to de-emphasize difference. Someone in acceptance tends to comprehend similarities and differences. And then someone in adaptation is someone who's able to bridge across cultures, even those cultures that are different than their own. So this is the way that we were able to help individuals in our cohort, recognize where they were at in their own intercultural development, and be able to provide educational opportunities to help them move along on this continuum. So what individuals did was to take a questionnaire, a 50-item questionnaire that measures their intercultural competence within this continuum. And it's cross-culturally generalizable, it's valid and reliable. And this is the instrument developed by Cameron. So next slide. So the driver of our work, the research question of our work, was what is the most effective educational intervention for increasing an individual as well as a group, for us, the 4-H program in California, intercultural competence in order to facilitate the organization's diversity and facilitate the organization's inclusion goal. So the assumption for us with this study was that those who would take the survey were answering honestly. We also had an assumption that the profile, meaning the outcome from that survey, was an accurate indicator of the individual's response to cultural differences. And when they were responding to the survey, each person would think about his or her own cultural group and other cultural groups within those that they had the most experience. And that participants that were responding to the survey weren't at that time experiencing significant professional, personal, transitional experiences in their own lives. So the first cohort that we worked with, we had these stages of intervention. So the individual, on the far left, the individual feedback and plan. So after an individual completed the survey, they underwent these coaching sessions facilitated by myself, Faye, and those others that were identified on the slide of who is our team. And so that we help them understand the results of the survey, and we help them understand what we call the intercultural competence plan. Then they also engaged in these communities of practice. So we grouped people by based on the results of the survey. And in those groupings, the facilitation of the discussion was facilitated by the individual IDI, what we call QA. And so the team facilitated these discussions, and we developed the intercultural self-development to meet our organizational goals. So that was the purpose of the communities of practice, was to meet those goals. We also had a statewide conference in which we talked about cultural competence. We talked about cultural similarities and cultural differences, and also began to develop an action plan. And after these intervention opportunities for development of one's individual intercultural competence, we had the individuals take another survey, the post-IDI. After that survey was completed, they went through another coaching session with a person of the team, and they also revisited their individual goals and their individual intercultural development plan. So the results of this first cohort was that before, so the pretest, the first survey that the 89 individuals who were part of this first cohort, the results of that is that as a group, we were in minimization. And just as a reminder, minimization is that place where we understand similarities across culture, but we devalue or de-emphasize differences within and across cultures. So that's where we were, the 89 group. We can go back to that slide real quick. So after the test, the individuals who went through that intervention process, took the survey again, we actually moved from minimization over to acceptance. So acceptance is that place where we recognize the complexity of diversity, and we actually come to understand and appreciate similarities and, most importantly, differences within culture. But our tests of this, when we ran a multiple regression analysis, we found that the amount of time that we spend in this self-reflective, intentional process of understanding culture, both within our own cultural understanding in place, as well as other cultural understanding in place, that time that is spent seems to be the variable that significantly predicts the increases in our intercultural competence. But we weren't actually able to find an individual component of those multiple interventions that we had. We weren't able to understand if there was a single one of those that would predict this, the results of this intervention. Next slide. So given this first cohort, what we've learned from that, what were we going to change for this next round? What were we going to do that would make the educational intervention better to reach our diversity and inclusion goals? So what we determined was that we were going to develop, next slide please, intercultural competence learning circles. So what we had before were communities of practice. Now what we were doing was creating these learning circles so that we could have a very organized and intentional process that everybody who was engaged, voluntarily engaged in this intercultural development would actually have enough similarities across the state of California, independent of who in our team was facilitating that process, that they would receive similar experiences. So that would help them in this intentional self-reflection to improve how things are done and what we're doing. So next slide. So what we did is we created these webinars based on these 4 topics. And the individual participating in this would go through these pre-recorded webinars and then come together in these learning circles to discuss both what was in their webinar and other components and how that webinar touched on their own understanding, where they were in intercultural competence. So the first webinar was based on terms. So we wanted to make sure everybody understood, what does culture mean, diversity, inclusion, belonging, and cultural competence. What do those terms mean? So once we got a base understanding of those terms, we moved into talking about those points along the intercultural continuum, that arch, that arrow that was shown earlier. So the second Learning Circle webinar was talking about denial and polarization orientations. The third was focused on minimization. And the fourth was focused on acceptance and adaptations. So this helped us ensure that independent of whose group someone was with, whose Learning Circle participant was with, and where they were in the state of California, who was their facilitator, that they received these 4 consistent topics in their Learning Circles. Next slide. So our second intervention of our intercultural competence included this statewide conference, again, where we talked about cultural competence, similarities and differences, and now Learning Circles, right? We had these webinars, we had these facilitated discussions, and we really dove deep into understanding our orientations in intercultural competence. And we looked at that, and we developed these opportunities for individuals in these learning circles to discuss their own intercultural competence so that we could start to move as an organization along this continuum of intercultural competence. And we also had a post-IDI, or the post-survey, where they received again a coaching session on how to understand the results of that survey and to revisit their own individual goals and their planning. So the results of the second cohort is that we did find a drop in participation in completing the survey, but we continue to march forward in shifting our intercultural development as an organization. So again, we went from minimization over to acceptance, and more solidly in acceptance, moving toward adaptation along this continuum of intercultural development. We wanted to know, now that we've created this intentional learning process, these 4 focused webinars, kind of controlling in some part this intentional process of understanding intercultural competence. What could we take from that experience? Could we understand what of this, all these interventions, all these points helping individuals learn and increase their own intercultural competence? Could we identify if there was a single experience or a single intervention or a couple of interventions help us understand how we were able to move from minimization into acceptance? So we weren't able to, we did a series of regression analyses, and we weren't able to find any significant predictive effect of any of those professional development activities on the developmental orientation, on the intercultural competence as a group that participated in this process. But we do know, just to reiterate, we do know that this intentional process of self-reflecting and spending time on this process of intercultural capacity and competence, that was a huge part of what moved us as an organization from minimization into acceptance toward adaptation. All right, okay. Let's
okay. So thank you, Dorina. So now, in addition to seeing numbers and seeing how we have this intervention, the combination of interventions has increased intercultural competence of 4-H professionals, I'm sharing with you the perspectives of both 4-H professionals and county directors that have been part of this project. So one person shares, I thought I was pretty accepting of different cultures. What I didn't realize is how I view people through my own Northern European lens. The team helped me view different cultures in a completely different lens. Before, I was hesitant to engage people of other cultures for fear I would insult them by saying something wrong without realizing it. The IDI has given me the tools and confidence to do so. Another person shares, The IDI has given me the tools to better understand diverse communities and has rekindled my commitment to continue this important work. And here I share the perspectives of two county directors. The first person says, the IDI program first and foremost gave me the space and time with supporting knowledgeable trainers to really learn about my own culture and my orientation to others' cultures. Building upon that awareness, the subsequent trainings and interaction with fellow trainees made it possible to practice and gain confidence with appreciating and including cultural differences to strengthen our teams and communities. I found the experience humbling and difficult at times. I also recognize the real growth I benefited from and that still continues. A second county director shared, working on my own intercultural competency over the last several years has helped me better understand my community, improve trainings, and build new collaborations. This process has helped me be aware of my communication style and how to adapt to better connect with my team, clientele, and partners. I am incredibly grateful for the opportunity to engage in this work. And here we share with you some of the organizational outcomes. This model of intercultural competence professional development is now institutionalized in the California 4-H Youth Development Program. Between 2014 and 2017, we saw significant growth in youth participation by 39%, and Latino youth participation increased by 151%. Although we know that we cannot attribute this growth to intercultural competence, yet we know from the research that intercultural competence in professionals has a positive impact in reaching and engaging diverse populations. As part of our efforts after the first conference, we invested considerable time in changing the program's practices and policies to address the interest of diverse populations and places, and this continues. And we also have a shared language on diversity, equity, and intercultural competence. So when we think about what next in terms of, what kind of resources and time are needed to have a similar effort like this one in other programs in A&R, there's some important things to consider. Over a 3-year period, we invested a total of 7,404 hours, or the equivalent of 3.55 FTE, to support this effort. Each of the QAs provides individual coaching, to each participant for anywhere between, 3 to 5 hours on just that individual coaching. And then there's all of the group learning that we have shared, plus the conference. So that's something to consider. In addition, the cost to implement this goes anywhere between $60,000 and $80,000 a year. So in conclusion, the development of intercultural competence is complex. So all efforts need to be done by properly trained individuals with high levels of intercultural competence. And I would say that our team consists of these individuals. Professional development must be targeted to an individual's orientation. So when we shared with you that, arrow with all of the orientations, the information that all of the learning interventions were targeted at the group's orientation. And that's intentional every single time we provide training. And then ongoing professional development is needed to make measurable changes in intercultural competence. Ms. Hammer has states that 30 to 50 hours on intentional self-reflective efforts are needed to show a measurable gain in intercultural competence. And here's are some of the references that we have used throughout. And this concludes our presentation. Thank you very much. And we can open it now for questions.
Thank you so much, Faye and Davina. amazing information, and congratulations on all of your hard work. So Stephanie, I see you've raised your hand and you have a question. Feel free to go ahead and ask your question. You can unmute yourself. Oop, someone else, she's not quite ready. So if there are other questions, if anybody else would like to go first, Stephanie doesn't have a microphone, so perhaps she will be typing in her question. If anyone else has a question at this point, we'd be happy to entertain that.
This is Jody, and I just have a quick question. If people are grouped according to the orientation results, isn't it still pretty challenging because within a group there is still a spectrum of acceptance or understanding or awareness?
Jody, yes. So for instance, the conference, the statewide conference, the first one was aimed at people in minimization of the content. But because we knew that we had a few people in acceptance and a few people in adaptation and also a few people, in the other, so some activities were designed to meet people at various orientations.
Thank you.
So here's a question from Stephanie. This is such amazing work, and it is beautiful to see such intentional and intensive work take place in UC-A&R. I am curious about whether this has also translated into more discussions of intercultural competence between 4-H professionals and 4-H participants.
I can take that question, and Darina, you can add if you have other additional information. So in the first round, we invited volunteers to be part of this process. We invited about 10 volunteers as a pilot. 2 of them were from my county, and after they received feedback, they said this was too much commitment, and they dropped out. So then the 4-H program, the California 4-H program, now has developed intercultural competence webinars, short ones, as a way to begin to build 4-H volunteers' intercultural competence.
Yeah, it's a bit challenging because, as we've noted, time is the critical part of the success of helping an organization move along that cultural continuum. And our 4-H volunteers are giving time, so it's a matter of helping them understand the benefits to giving even more time to this process. So that's I think the conundrum that we have in 4-H.
Yeah, and I can add, Stephanie, that in my county, what I have found successful, so in addition, we didn't really spend time talking about the intercultural conflict styles inventory, but that is part of this learning. So in my county, since conflict seems to thrive in 4-H, I did a session on intercultural conflict styles, which volunteers absolutely loved. And so I continued to do that. So I did that about 2 years ago. So I continue to do that because that's the extent of commitment they're willing to give to this process.
So we have a few more questions that have come in. The first, what do you attribute to the serious decline in participation? Too much commitment? Has the cross-cultural interaction with those folks changed?
Yeah, the attrition rate is in part attributable to the staff turnover that we have. So retirements and turnover in staff is part of the explanation there. We have an average of about 15 people per year on the turnover in 4-H staff and academics.
And then there were some there's a question about the webinars that have been created and whether or not those are available for UC A&R staff and academics to review.
Those webinars, Jeanette, that we have created are part of that educational intervention that starts with knowing where people are at in terms of orientation. So they're designed as a flipped learning setup. So people watch the webinar and then there's followed by a discussion. So the learning is reinforced by having like a 2-hour group discussion. So at present, they're not available for UC A&R staff and academics to view because who would do that second part, right? And then we also want to be cognizant that that we're developing these interventions for people along the orientation. They need to be developmental. The other question about were there people who refused training because it was too hard? No, not really.
No. I will say though that it was certainly emotionally challenging for some people, and true for, I would say, all of us have place of learning and reflection, and it's sometimes painful. So yes, it can be hard, but I'm not aware of anyone who refused training.
No, and the second question, what did you do to encourage meaningful participation? So if I go back to this slide, the change slide, the Cotter slide, the whole rollout of this project was done very thorough. I mean, like we thought about it. We had, for 6 months before we even started it, we had sent key messages about this project to build buy-in, like, this step right here. So for 6 months in a row, we presented at, county directors meetings, we presented at the virtual brown bags, we sent information, and it was this was voluntary participation. We answered everybody's questions or potential fears about this. Was this going to be, tied into their performance expectations? We said no. So we had the support of HR because people would call HR also with concerns. So once we stopped getting these kind of questions, then we started implementing it. But it was a very intentionally communicated and team buy-in process before we implemented this project.
Well, I think that concludes all the questions, and in recognition of honoring time, we are at 10:33. So I would encourage and invite those of you who have further questions to connect with Faye or Dorina directly. And in conclusion, I just want to thank not only all of our participants who tuned in today, but also Faye and Dorina for sharing this information about this really amazing work that you've been doing. So thank you so much, and have a good week, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm done. Hi, how are you?